Imperialism gave the new imperialists a new market, a new labor force, and a new supply of raw materials. Imperialism brought about a lot of political order and stability to many of the colonies. Africa, for example, was tamed. Regional disputes and warfare were stopped. Unnecessary wars were curbed. The products manufactured by the colonies were sold in the international market, hence making the colonies richer. The colonies were now expanding economically. Nations were unified and globalization occurred following imperialism. The euphoria that gripped Cubans in the last days of 1898 was beyond imaginable. Their country had been racked by rebellion for 30 years, and the last few were filled with terrible suffering. The American military governor of Cuba, General John Brooke, made a sudden announcement. He would not allow anyone to enter Havana, the capital of Cuba. Those who tried would be turned back. The United States also declared that they did not recognize the rebel army and wished it to disband. This outraged Cubans, especially the thousands who had fought so long for independence. The United States took away their great prize, their independence, away from them at the very last moment. The United States did not allow Cuba to profit from its own economy or resources because American businesses were consuming a great percentage of Cuban resources. With their power over Cuban resources, American businesses could control the Cuban economy and profit more from it than Cubans. The use of the Cuban economy and resources were mainly used for American gain, and it was not fair to the Cubans. With this abuse of power provoked the already angry Cubans to feel more anger towards the U.S. With these unfair relations, long-term tensions arose between Cuba and the U.S. because Cuba remains unhappy about their treatment. The Platt Amendment was passed as part of the Army Reparations Bill. It was a treaty between the United States and Cuba that protected Cuba's independence from foreign intervention. It gave the U.S. permission to intervene in Cuban affairs. Other conditions of the amendment included that the Cuban government implement plans to improve sanitary conditions of the island, relinquish claims on the Isle of Pines, and agree to sell or lease territory for coaling and naval stations to the United States. Finally, the amendment required the Cuban government to conclude a treaty with the United States that would make the Platt Amendment legally binding, and the United States pressured the Cubans to incorporate the terms of the Platt Amendment in the Cuban Constitution. Not all of the United States' relations with Cuba had a negative impact, but the Cubans could not see this because they were so upset with the U.S. The military base stationed in Cuba was helping Cuba economically, but Cuba could only see the U.S. in it, and the Cubans' hatred for the U.S. prevented them from being able to recognize how much they profited from the military base. Therefore, the relationship between Cuba and the U.S. was completely destroyed because of the Platt Amendment, despite the United States' attempts to help Cuba both politically and economically. The bitterness of the Cubans became clear when they described the U.S. military base as a dagger plunged into the heart of Cuban soil. With this statement, it is evident that Cuba will only see the United States' involvement with them and their land as a negative thing.
How has imperialism in general progressed throughout the years?
Well, I think it depends on how far you want to go back, because you could go back to the Roman Empire and you could see imperialism at work then. But that was mostly imperialism of armies and conquest. But especially from the 19th century onwards, imperialism became much more about controlling economic production, controlling food, controlling mines, controlling people.
Why do you think it got like this?
Well, in the end, capitalism developed like that because that's how industrial capitalism was developing. It came out of Western Europe and then the United States, and it wasn't just about conquering territories, it was about connecting Africa and Asia and Latin America and Cuba into the lines of production that then fed these big capitalist economies. So I guess in Cuba's case, it was producing sugarcane and other crops for the United States especially.
Do you think that the United States taking over Cuba was a good thing? Many in Cuba still regard Americans taking over Cuba as a bad thing, but Americans pride themselves in what they did. What do you think?
Well, I think even at the time there were quite a few Americans who disagreed with the decision to occupy Cuba. I think there was an anti-war movement even in the United States back then. So I'm not sure it's true that all Americans even then agreed that occupying Cuba was a good thing. And those who thought it was a good thing, I guess, believed it was part of their mission to civilize Cuba, to bring American-style government and perhaps American-style religion to Cuba. But of course, that was never going to work. And from the beginning, there was resistance, and it grew and grew.
Did America take advantage of Cuba because they saw them as weak?
I'm sure they did. I mean, part of it is racial attitudes as well. It's not just seeing people in other countries as weak, it's also seeing them as inferior. And that then, in the eyes of people who support imperialism, gives them the right to occupy and dominate and exploit people.
Do you think the Platt Amendment was a disadvantage or an advantage to Cuba? Many Americans that were involved say that the military bases involved in Cuba raised economics in Cuba significantly, while they thought that Cubans were ignoring the progression because they were angry at the Americans.
So what was the Platt Amendment?
It was a treaty between the United States and Cuba that protected Cuba's independence from foreign intervention, but it gave the U.S. permission to intervene in Cuban affairs.
Well, I guess all that goes to prove in the end that even if you provide people with what you think is economic prosperity or economic growth, often it's not enough, because people also value their political autonomy, and often they'll see that growth, even if an economy is growing, it's a question of who benefits from the growth. So I think for a lot of Cubans then, it wasn't simply a question of whether the economy was growing, but in whose interest was it growing.
Okay, thank you.